Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Death Row History Channel. I am your host, Mr. Toad. And tonight, we will continue our journey through botched executions. Last video, we covered lethal injection. I gave you 5 examples of botched executions, and all of them being mundane. Well, tonight is not anything like that. There is no mundane executions with this next method. And at this point, I will go ahead and say, if you have a weak constitution, watch this video in segments. Because tonight, we are looking at the gas chamber. Probably the most brutal and gruesome method of death that has been conceived in America. Even the thought behind the conception of the gas chamber was brutally barbaric. I covered it in one of my earlier videos, but I will go ahead and recover it. In a nutshell, the history of the gas chamber, or the idea of the gas chamber, was conceived in the 1920s in Nevada by the governor who was against the death penalty. His thought was, if I can come up with a method of execution that is so brutal that nobody in the state likes it, they will vote to get rid of the death penalty. Obviously it failed, because there are still states with the gas chamber on the books in 2021. But the idea for the gas chamber was the battlefields of World War I. They saw these images of clouds of gas being blown across no man's land into the trenches, and they thought, if it's killing soldiers and they're not realizing it, then it will kill an inmate and them not realize it. So Nevada built a gas chamber and started using it. History is weird, folks. So tonight we will be covering 2 executions. But before we get into the executions, I want to cover some facts here. Number 1, the interesting thing with the gas chamber is that most states that use the gas chamber as their primary method is they have refurbished the chamber to house their gurney for lethal injection. California, I think Arizona, and I think Mississippi are the big 3. I know for sure California's gurney is in the old gas chamber. Number 2, the gas chamber is the most dangerous method of execution, because there is so much that can go wrong that there is a higher rate of things going wrong than any other method. And what I mean by this is, you're dealing with cyanide gas. So, the gas chamber has to be airtight. The door has to seal, and it has to have an airtight seal for it to work. If it doesn't have an airtight seal, it leaks. And where does it go? It goes into the outside, into the room with the witnesses, with prison staff, with everybody but the condemned. which means you have about 30 seconds to get the hell out of Dodge before you die. Because it's not it's very volatile. And so that's why I have always said the gas chamber is the most gruesome way to die. I personally would never consider it if I had the option. However, Oklahoma does have gas chamber on the gas chamber on the books, but we use nitrogen hypoxia. Again, folks, I have a video over that. If you want to watch that, go ahead. But again, in a nutshell, nitrogen hypoxia, or the idea for it, is that you put the condemned in a chamber, you strap them into a chair, you flip a switch, and you suck all of the oxygen out of the room. So therefore they're breathing in nitrogen. They go to sleep and die. Quick and painless. However, it has never been proven, even though 4 states have it on the books. So, sometime in your lifetime, you will probably see nitrogen hypoxia being used as a method of execution. I, for one, am actually waiting on that day because it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And no, that's not because I'm a morbid person. I'm just legitimately curious if it is as humane as they claim. Now, the botch rate of lethal gas is 5.4%, which means out of 593 gas chamber executions, only 32 have been botched. Taking that further, there has only been 2 gas chamber executions post-Furman. So, there were 530 pre-Furman, primarily out on the West Coast. Because in the West, they thought the electric chair was too gruesome. So they went with the gas chamber. Wyoming, at one point, Wyoming, Utah, or Wyoming, Nevada, Arizona, California, Missouri, all had the gas chamber. It wasn't like the electric chair, it wasn't like lethal injection where everybody and their brother had it. No, there were certain states that had it, and certain states that you either, at one point in American history, you either had the electric chair or you had the gas chamber. That was it. But Westerners have always been more, I guess, liberal, and they thought that the electric chair was too gruesome, so they went with the gas chamber. The only southern state to actually go with the gas chamber was Mississippi, which is where our first case is coming from. The great state of Mississippi, home to such monuments as Vicksburg, the Parchman Farm, which is where this execution took place at, Parchman State Penitentiary in Yazoo City, Mississippi. The individual would be Jimmy Lee Gray. The date, September 1983. Again, the state, Mississippi. It says that they had to clear the room. Jimmy Lee Gray's execution has always gone down in history as one of the worst of any method, because if anything that could go wrong with Mr. Gray, with an execution, went wrong with Jimmy Lee Gray's execution. Jimmy Lee Gray is part of the reason why Mississippi would ultimately get rid of the gas chamber. And he is also the reason why Mississippi ended up installing a head restraint on the chair of the gas chamber. What happened was Jimmy Lee Gray, they took him in, they strapped him in, they threw the switch, the egg dropped into the acid, the room fills with cyanide. Everything's going according to plan. However, Jimmy Lee Gray is gasping for air. And watching Mr. Gray gasp for air repulsed the witnesses. So they had to escort the witnesses out while Mr. Gray died, because they couldn't stand to watch him. His attorney would later criticize the state for doing that while he was still alive. Now, Jimmy Lee Gray did not die from breathing cyanide. They do autopsies on a lot of executions after the fact. Now, Jimmy Lee Gray died because there was a steel pole behind where the chair was. So, the chair here, pole here. Jimmy Lee Gray died because his head kept hitting the pole. Pole here, chair here. And from reports I've read, he actually fractured the back of his skull because of repeated blunt force trauma against this pole. So Mr. Gray died from blunt force trauma, not from the breathing of cyanide. And the reporters counted his moans, which was 11. So it took 11 moans. In 11 moans, he died. Which is, yeah. And if this execution could not get any worse, they would later find out that the guy who pulled the switch was drunk at the time he pulled the switch. Gotta love the South, folks. So, you have a drunk executioner. You have a inmate who is really just... he has no role in it. They strap him to the chair and they leave him. So you've got a drunk executioner. You've got an inmate who obviously does not want to die. You've got reporters, witnesses, who cannot stomach watching this man die, so they leave the room. And then you've got faulty equipment by the state of Mississippi, i.e. not having a headrest on the gas chamber chair and head restraints to keep inmates from dying in such a method as Mr. Gray. So, again, if an execution could go wrong, if you were to sit down and draw up how could an execution go wrong, Jimmy Lee Gray would be the textbook example. I have always wondered about these things. But yes, Mr. Gray would be this example. And then in April of 1996, you have Donald Eugene Harding out of Arizona. Now, Mr. Harding's death would not be as bad as Mr. Gray's. Well, it's the gas chamber, so it's going to be a horrid death, but it was not as botched as Mr. Gray's. It says here that Donald Harding would not be pronounced dead for 10.5 minutes after the cyanide tablets dropped. So it took 10 minutes for him to die. Yeah. Which is, I guess, about average. I really don't know how long it takes for for gas chamber executions, but 10.5 minutes is still quicker than lethal injection, so, and electrocution, but that's beside the point. After the cyanide capsules, okay, during the execution, Harding thrashed and struggled violently against the restraining straps. Well, of course he's gonna struggle against the straps. He's breathing in cyanide, you know, it's not something you're gonna just sit there and take. Lethal injection is a very brutal execution. But, so, a journalist who witnessed the execution said that Harding's spasms and jerks lasted for 6 minutes and 37 seconds. Obviously, this man was suffering, and this was a violent death. Well, no shit. An ugly event. And they would go on to say that we put animals to death more humanely. Well, not around where I live. But then again, I live in the country, so. And a lot of the people here it costs too much to have an animal put down by the vet, so they go to alternative methods. Another witness would say that Mr. Harding's death was extremely violent, he was in great pain, and that she heard him gasp and moan. Well, of course she did. It's a gas chamber. It's a gas chamber execution. It's not going to be pleasant. The problem is, if you have never witnessed an execution before, you don't know what to expect. And if you walk into a gas chamber execution as your first, you're in for a rough time. She saw him turn from red to purple as he consumed the gases. And another reporter said that he suffered from insomnia and assorted illnesses for several weeks, and 2 others were left as walking vegetables for a couple of days. So, the gruesomeness of Mr. Harding's execution would leave a very indelible mark on these people's brains, as did the people who witnessed Jimmy Lee Gray. They got up and left. That right there tells you how bad that execution was. And I don't remember the inmate. I don't know who the inmate was. It may have been Mr. Gray. It may not have been. But I remember reading somewhere that there was actually a gas chamber execution where the inmate broke the restraints and was running around the chamber, banging his head against the wall, against the glass, as the gas filled the room. So again, these are not clean executions. These are not the lethal injection where they just put a needle in your arm, or the electric chair where they run 50,000 or 20,000 volts of electricity through you. No. This is a very brutal, very gruesome way to die. And I can't imagine why. I remember reading a story in Missouri within the last 2 years where there was an inmate suing the state of Missouri to be put to death by gas chamber over lethal injection because he had concerns about Missouri's process for lethal injection. While I understand the reason, I don't get it. I don't understand why you would choose such a brutal method. But anyway, folks, this is everybody's favorite mythical creature, the one, the only, Mr. Toad, with the Death Row History Channel, saying, I hope you're all having a wonderful weekend, and I'm gone.